Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human researched and written material. So I want to ask you something right off the bat. Have you ever been so completely overwhelmed by just terrifying headlines or, by the sheer volume of global chaos, or maybe just a sudden wave of existential dread that you just wanted to give up on your daily responsibilities? I mean, if you've ever looked at the news and thought, what is the point of going to work today or doing the laundry or, planning for next year if the world is clearly ending tomorrow? Well, you are not the first to feel that kind of paralysis.
No, definitely not. It's a very ancient feeling, actually.
Right, because in 52 AD, an entire community basically stopped going to work because of a rumor, a literal rumor. So today, we are taking a deep dive into a letter written to stop that exact panic, the biblical book of 2 Thessalonians. And we're running it through the historical analysis of two really heavyweight commentators, Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry. We want to figure out how to survive an era of disinformation and, reclaim a sense of grounding.
Yeah, and it really is a profound psychological state to examine. I mean, we tend to view information overload and, apocalyptic doom scrolling as uniquely 21st century problems, right?
Right.
Like they were born out of smartphones and 24-hour news cycles.
Oh, for sure. We think we invented anxiety.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the emotional architecture behind that dread, the way the human nervous system responds to the feeling that history is just, collapsing in on itself, is incredibly ancient. The triggers are different, but the human response is identical.
That's so true. But before we jump into the text itself, we should probably establish who Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry actually are, because we are going to be relying on them heavily to code this.
Right. That's a necessary foundation to lay.
Yeah, so for the listener who might just be hearing these names for the very first time today, why are we bringing in a couple of guys from the, 17th and 19th centuries to help us navigate life in 2026?
Well, Matthew Henry was a British nonconformist minister writing in the early 1700s. And he lived in a time when preaching outside the Church of England could, literally get you fined or imprisoned.
Wow, okay, so he wasn't just sitting in an ivory tower.
Not at all. He fundamentally understood societal pressure, and his commentary is famous for its devotional warmth and really its deep pastoral understanding of human nature.
Okay, so that's Henry. What about Barnes?
Right. So Albert Barnes, on the other hand, was an American Presbyterian minister, and he was writing in the mid-19th century. He was actually heavily involved in the abolitionist movement.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was a very fascinating figure. And his commentaries are highly analytical. I mean, he dives incredibly deep into the Greek syntax, the historical context, and the strict logical progression of the arguments.
So we kind of get the best of both worlds here.
Exactly. By combining Henry's pastoral insight with Barnes's rigorous historical analysis, we get a really comprehensive, multi-dimensional view of the text.
I love that. And just a note for you listening, we are using the World English Bible translation for the actual text of 2 Thessalonians today. But to really wrap our heads around the heartbeat of this letter, we have to talk about the city of Thessalonica itself. Because, this wasn't some quiet, isolated village in the middle of nowhere. Right?
Oh, not at all. Thessalonica was the capital of the Roman province of Macedonia. It was a bustling, very wealthy, completely cosmopolitan metropolis.
Like a major hub.
A massive hub.
Yeah.
Crucially, it sat right on the Via Egnatia.
The what?
The Via Egnatia. It was essentially the superhighway of the ancient Roman world. It connected Rome directly to the eastern provinces. So because of its location, it was a huge center for trade, philosophy, and, of course, religion.
Okay, so lots of traffic, lots of money, lots of ideas flowing through.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it was also fiercely loyal to Rome. The imperial cult, which was the worship of the Roman emperor as a literal deity, was deeply ingrained in the civic and economic life of the city.
So wait, when this newly formed community of Christians starts claiming that Jesus is Lord, they aren't just making a private, quiet, spiritual statement.
No, not at all.
In that specific culture, saying Jesus is Lord sounds dangerously close to saying Caesar is not.
Right. It was viewed as political treason.
Man, that is a dangerous game to play in the ancient world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And because of that, this community was living in what we can really only describe as a pressure cooker. They were facing intense, unrelenting, and completely systemic persecution.
Like what kind of persecution? Are we talking just people being mean to them?
Far worse. If you didn't participate in the civic pagan rituals, you could be shut out of the trade guilds.
Oh, so economic sanctions.
Exactly. That meant you couldn't buy or sell goods. You lost your livelihood. And beyond that, you faced physical violence, severe social ostracization, and total financial ruin.
That is heavy.
That is the external reality they were waking up to every single day.
Which honestly makes the opening of this letter so incredibly jarring to me.
How so?
Well, the author, the Apostle Paul, he writes to them right in the middle of this awful suffering. And he doesn't start by saying, I'm so sorry this is happening. God is going to rescue you tomorrow.
Right. He doesn't offer an immediate escape hatch.
No. Instead, he says something that feels entirely counterintuitive. He says he is bound to thank God for them because their faith is growing exceedingly and their charity, their love toward each other abounds despite all these severe persecutions.
He essentially celebrates the fact that the pressure hasn't broken them.
Yeah. Which is a wild way to open a letter to traumatize people.
It is. But he goes a step further, and this is where the theology gets very deep. He tells them that their endurance and their faith in the middle of this nightmare is a manifest token of the righteous judgment of God, meaning they will be counted worthy of the kingdom for which they are suffering.
Okay, I really want to hover on that phrase for a second. Manifest token. It sounds very formal.
It does in English.
Yeah.
The Greek word used there is endegma. And it is a fascinating word because it only appears this one single time in the entire New Testament.
Wait, really? Just once?
Just once.
Huh.
And Albert Barnes spends a significant amount of time analyzing this. Endegma means an indication, a token, or a proof. It is something that points out the undeniable reality of a thing.
A proof. Okay, I'm trying to think of a modern way to visualize this. It kind of reminds me of stress testing a server network.
Oh, that's an interesting angle. Tell me more.
Well, like you can write all the code you want and say, hey, this server can handle 10 million concurrent users. But I mean, that is just a theory on a whiteboard until you actually run a massive simulated DDoS attack against it.
Right. You have to test it in reality.
Exactly. And the attack itself doesn't make the server strong. The attack provides the enigma, the undeniable proof that the architecture actually holds up under maximum load.
Yes.
The pressure just reveals the structural integrity of the system.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. Or, think about structural engineering. A bridge looks perfectly sturdy on a sunny day with no traffic.
Anybody can build a bridge for a sunny day.
Exactly. But it's the hurricane force winds and the heavy freight trucks that actually prove the engineering is sound. Now, Barnes is very careful to note here that Paul is not saying their suffering is earning them salvation.
Okay, that's an important distinction.
It's vital. They aren't buying their way into heaven through pain. Nobody merits a reward simply because they experienced hardship.
Right, suffering isn't a currency.
Exactly. Rather, the manner in which they are bearing these extreme trials is developing and revealing their internal character.
So the focus isn't on the pain itself, it's on their response to the pain.
Correct. The pressure is forcing what is truly inside them up to the surface.
And what's coming to the surface isn't, bitterness or cruelty.
No, or a desire for violent revenge. What is coming to the surface is patience, an exceedingly growing faith, and an abounding love for one another. That response is the enigma.
It's the proof that their faith isn't just a shallow philosophy, but a deeply rooted reality.
Yes. Barnes actually points out that you can generally learn what the ultimate outcome of a person's life will be by watching how they bear unfair trials. Do they turn toxic or do they become more resilient and compassionate?
I'm going to stop you right there, actually, because while that idea of character building is really inspiring, we hit a massive obstacle in the very next few lines of the text.
Ah, yes. I know exactly where you're going.
Yeah, because Barnes and Henry might be totally comfortable with this. But to a modern listener in 2026, the language suddenly shifts into something deeply uncomfortable.
It does take a very sharp turn.
It really does. The text pivots from, hey, your patience is a proof of your character, to some incredibly intense, punitive language about divine vengeance. It literally says that the Lord Jesus will be revealed from heaven in flaming fire, taking vengeance and inflicting everlasting destruction on those who are troubling the innocent.
It's extremely graphic language.
I mean, I have to push back on this. This sounds like an archaic revenge fantasy. How do Barnes and Henry possibly justify this flaming fire stuff as a good or necessary thing? It feels totally out of step with any modern concept of rehabilitation or tolerance.
It absolutely challenges modern sensibilities. We live in an era that, thankfully, heavily emphasizes restorative justice, and we often recoil at the idea of divine wrath or cosmic punishment. It feels primitive to us.
It feels very primitive.
But if we dig into Barnes and Henry's analysis, they argue that we need to look at this strictly through the eyes of the victims. They argue that this language speaks to a profound, universal human craving for ultimate justice, especially when earthly justice has entirely failed.
Okay, clarify that for me, because craving justice and flaming fire still feel miles apart to my brain.
Put yourself in the shoes of a first-century believer in Thessalonica for a moment. You are an innocent person. Your business has just been burned down. Your friends have been imprisoned or even executed by powerful political elites who act with total impunity.
Right. And nobody is coming to help me?
Exactly. There is no police force coming to save you. You cannot appeal to the courts because the courts are run by the very people oppressing you. The entire Roman Empire is structurally stacked against you.
Complete powerlessness.
If you are in that position of absolute powerlessness and someone tells you, don't worry, the universe is just a random collision of atoms and your oppressors will eventually die peacefully in their beds and get away with this forever, that is not a comforting thought.
No, that's horrific.
It is the ultimate soul-crushing despair.
Right. It basically means the bullies win. It means the tyrants who destroy thousands of lives face zero consequences in the grand scheme of things.
Yes, and Matthew Henry notes that it is a fundamental moral instinct for humans to believe that it is a, quote, righteous thing with God to recompense tribulation to them that trouble you.
It's wired into us.
Barnes argues that human beings constantly make laws and affix severe penalties to them because we fundamentally believe that wrongdoers should face consequences. I mean, we build prisons. We demand accountability in our human courts.
So he's saying, why would God be any less just than a human judge?
Precisely. Barnes asks, why should we demand justice in our flawed human systems but deny the necessity of it in the cosmic order?
Wow. Okay, so the promise of a perfectly righteous judge who will eventually balance the scales isn't about promoting violence, it's actually about preventing it.
Exactly. The psychological weight of this promise is that it provides profound comfort to the victims and frees them from the terrible burden of taking vengeance into their own hands.
I see.
With absolute certainty that ultimate justice will be served by a higher power, you don't have to become a monster to get even. You don't have to form a violent mob and burn down the houses of the people who hurt you.
You can endure. You can maintain your moral integrity because you aren't the one responsible for the final reckoning.
Yes.
That is a massive paradigm shift. It means I don't have to destroy my own soul trying to destroy my enemy. I can just trust the scales will balance. And, while most of us listening today aren't facing first-century Roman persecution, we deal with unfairness constantly.
We do, every day.
We see systemic injustices, corrupt leaders enriching themselves, or even just, toxic workplaces where people lie and cheat their way to the top while those who actually play by the rules just get stepped on.
The translation to our modern reality is really about how we process that unfairness. When we are wronged, the immediate human instinct is always retaliation.
Oh, always.
But this text challenges us to defer that instinct. It challenges us to trust that justice is a foundational element of the universe, not some rare anomaly.
So for you listening right now, consider how you approach the unfairness in your own life. When you are facing an unjust situation at work, a betrayal by someone you really trusted, or just the heavy weight of the world's cruelty, ask yourself, how can my response to this pressure become an enigma, an undeniable proof of my character, rather than just a bitter reflection of my terrible circumstances?
That is the core question. Can you maintain your integrity, knowing that ultimate justice isn't your personal burden to carry?
It's tough, but it's incredibly freeing.
And that internal fortitude is exactly what Paul was trying to build in them. Because if the external pressure of persecution was testing their structure, an internal panic was actively melting their wiring.
Oh, here we go.
And this shift in the letter moves us directly from the realm of physical suffering into a crisis of severe psychological distress.
A rumor.
Yes, the rumor. In chapter 2, Paul transitions very abruptly. He writes to them, pleading with them not to be shaken in mind or troubled.
Because they heard something terrifying.
Right. They had received some form of communication, a spirit, a spoken word, or quite possibly a forged letter, claiming to be directly from Paul himself, asserting that the day of Christ, the final judgment, and the literal end of the world was already present.
I am fascinated by the phrase, shaken in mind. It feels so violent to me.
It is a violent physical metaphor. The Greek word Paul uses is saluthenai.
Saluthenai.
Yes, saluthenai. It literally means being tossed like a ship on the waves during a violent storm or being blown about by a hurricane-force wind.
Good grief.
It implies a state of profound mental and emotional seasickness. They were completely unmoored from reality.
Because they thought they had missed the boat. I mean, they are looking around at all the horrible persecution. They read this forged letter and they conclude, this is it. The end of history is happening right now, today.
Precisely. And Paul steps in as a stabilizing force. He essentially tells them to take a deep breath, look at the data, and stop reacting to shadows.
He grounds them.
He says, let no man deceive you by any means. And then he gives them a logical sequence of historical events that must occur before the end comes, proving that they are not currently in the apocalypse.
So he basically gives them a timeline.
Yes. He mentions that a falling away, a great apostasy or defection from the truth, must happen first.
Okay.
Then the man of sin, the son of perdition, must be revealed. He notes that the mystery of iniquity is already subtly at work, but it is currently being restrained by something or someone until that restraint is eventually taken out of the way.
We are definitely going to get into the identity of this man of sin and this restrainer, because I know Barnes and Henry have a lot to say about that.
Oh, they certainly do.
But before we get into the historical theology, I really want to look at the psychology of apocalyptic panic itself. It seems like an enduring human trait to believe that our specific generation, in our specific moment, is facing the literal end of the world.
It is a recurring psychological phenomenon throughout human history, without a doubt. And Albert Barnes provides a tragic, incredibly illustrative historical anecdote in his commentary to show just how dangerous this mindset can be.
I love a good historical anecdote. What is it?
He references the year 1843 in the United States and a religious movement known as the Millerites.
Okay, tell me about the Millerites. Who were they?
They were followers of a man named William Miller. He was a farmer in upstate New York who spent years intensely studying biblical prophecy, particularly the book of Daniel.
Okay, so a prophecy enthusiast.
Very much so. Through a series of complex and ultimately deeply flawed mathematical calculations, Miller determined that Jesus Christ would physically return to Earth between March 1843 and March 1844.
And people actually bought into this.
Hundreds of thousands of Americans bought into it.
Hundreds of thousands? Wait, in the 1840s, that's a massive percentage of the population.
It was. This wasn't a tiny fringe cult. It swept the nation. People were so absolutely convinced the world was ending that they stopped planting their crops.
Wow.
They sold their businesses, they gave away their life savings. But Barnes focuses heavily on the psychological toll this took.
I can't even imagine the anxiety.
The panic and absolute existential dread this induced was so profound that in the year 1843 alone, 17 people were admitted to the state lunatic asylum in Worcester, Massachusetts, purely because their minds snapped under the psychological weight of the impending apocalypse.
That is devastating. 17 people institutionalized because their brains simply could not handle the terror of a rumor.
It literally broke their minds.
And, you know, it is so easy for us to look back at the Millerites in 1843 or the Thessalonians in 52 AD and feel a sense of, I don't know, chronological snobbery. We think, oh, how naive they were. But we do the exact same thing today.
We do. The technological medium has changed, but the psychological mechanism is identical.
Exactly. Think about it. The forged letter that terrified the ancient Thessalonians was just their version of a modern deepfake video. It was first-century disinformation.
That's a very apt comparison.
Today, we're constantly bombarded by algorithms that are literally designed to profit off our panic. We open our phones and we are told that the global economy is collapsing tomorrow, that World War III is starting next week, or that artificial intelligence is going to exterminate humanity by Tuesday.
It is a viral doom-scrolling trend that generates mass panic.
It is the weaponization of fear to destabilize a population.
The Thessalonians were victims of a deliberate destabilization campaign. And Paul's response is a masterclass in grounding people. By giving them a sequence of events to look for, he is effectively telling them to engage their critical thinking.
Don't just react, think.
He is saying, do not let a feeling of dread override your knowledge of reality.
But in laying out that reality, Paul introduces some of the most hotly debated, complex concepts in the entire biblical text. He talks about this man of sin who sits in the temple of God, claiming to be God, operating with power, signs, and lying wonders.
Yes.
He talks about a mystery of iniquity. And this is where we have to address the elephant in the room regarding how our source commentaries interpret this text.
Yes, we do, and this requires strict adherence to the impartiality rule of our deep dive format.
Absolutely. So, listener, please hear this clearly. Before we go further, I have to jump in with a very strict impartiality rule for this deep dive. The historical commentaries we are using as our source material today, written by Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry centuries ago, argue heavily, explicitly, and at great length that this text regarding the man of sin and the great apostasy refers directly to the Roman Catholic papacy. We must make it entirely clear to you, the listener, that we are not endorsing this viewpoint or taking sides. We are simply conveying the historical interpretations provided in our source text to help you understand the history of how this letter has been read.
Thank you for laying that out so clearly. Yes, it is virtually impossible to read Barnes or Henry on 2 Thessalonians without confronting this.
It's everywhere in their notes.
Both of them dedicate extensive portions of their commentaries to aligning the characteristics of the man of sin with the historical actions and development of the papal system up to their respective eras.
So how exactly do they make that connection? Walk us through their historical argument. What are the mechanics of this interpretation?
They focus heavily on the idea of the restrainer. Remember, Paul says the mystery of iniquity is already at work, but something is holding it back.
Right.
Barnes and Henry, echoing many theologians of their time, argue that the early Christians understood this restrainer to be the Roman Empire itself.
The political entity of Rome.
Yes. As long as the Roman Caesars held absolute political and religious power in Rome, no other massive centralized authority could rise to take its place.
So what changed?
History changed. In the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine moved the capital of the empire away from Rome to Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople.
Ah, okay.
Barnes argues that this massive geopolitical shift left a power vacuum in the city of Rome. With the emperor gone, the Bishop of Rome gradually became the most powerful figure in the West.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
Precisely. Over the centuries, this spiritual role accumulated immense temporal political power.
And how do they connect that to the specific phrases Paul uses, like sitting in the temple claiming to be God, or using lying wonders?
Henry and Barnes point to the historical claims of papal infallibility and the assumption of power over civil magistrates and kings. They argue that claiming the authority to forgive sins or to speak with the absolute authority of God is the fulfillment of sitting in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God.
Okay, and the lying wonders.
For that, they point to the historical proliferation of unverified miracles in the Middle Ages.
Like what?
Things like weeping statues, relics claimed to have magical healing properties, or various apparitions. They view these as manipulative tools used to maintain control over a largely uneducated populace.
Okay, so that is the specific historical and theological lens our Protestant sources from the 17th and 19th centuries are using. But, our mission on this show is to find wisdom for the present.
Correct.
We are looking for the core truth that applies to a listener in 2026, regardless of their religious background or denominational stance. So if we look beneath those specific historical accusations, what is the enduring wisdom here? What is the core warning?
If you strip away the specific theological debate, the enduring wisdom is a profound, chilling warning against authoritarianism and the manipulation of truth.
That's incredibly relevant.
The danger Paul is warning about is not necessarily just one specific historical figure. It is any human system, any political leader, or any institution that demands ultimate, unquestioning, godlike allegiance based on fraudulent, manipulative claims. He calls this the deceivableness of unrighteousness.
The deceivableness of unrighteousness. That is a dense phrase. What does it actually mean in practice?
It means that the deception is highly attractive. It isn't obvious or repulsive. It appeals to something dark and selfish within human nature.
It tells you what you want to hear.
Exactly. Paul writes that people perish because they receive not the love of the truth.
Wow.
Matthew Henry makes a brilliant psychological point here. He says an erroneous mind and a vicious life often go together. If you do not actively love the truth, you become incredibly vulnerable to comfortable lies.
So you actively choose the delusion.
You will fall prey to strong delusions because deep down, you actually take pleasure in unrighteousness.
This is where it gets so incredibly relevant for us today, because we are living in what sociologists call a post-truth era.
We absolutely are.
I mean, we have AI-generated images that look totally indistinguishable from reality. We have customized algorithmic echo chambers. We have partisan news networks that cater exactly to what our specific demographic wants to hear. And the text says these people were deceived because they didn't have a love of the truth. Notice the phrasing. It doesn't just say they couldn't find the truth. It says they didn't love it.
That is the critical vulnerability of the human mind. If you love your political party or your preferred economic theory, or even your own personal comfort more than you love objective reality, you are ripe for deception.
You are a prime target.
You will eagerly consume lying wonders, which today look like fake news, manipulated statistics, and wild conspiracy theories because they validate your pre-existing biases.
Right.
The concept of the man of sin represents the seductive power of a lie that tells you exactly what you want to hear, making you a willing participant in your own delusion.
So how do you fight this? What is the practical step for the listener whose mind feels, like we said earlier, violently shaken by the constant barrage of conflicting information?
It has to be an intentional practice.
I think it is time to implement a personal truth filter protocol. Before you let a piece of breaking news shake your mind, before you let a viral video alter your mood or dictate your reality, you have to pause.
You have to interrupt the reaction cycle.
Ask yourself, am I verifying this source, or am I just believing it because it plays on my deepest fears? Do I actually love the truth here, even if it contradicts my established worldview? Or am I desperately looking for a comfortable delusion to justify my anger?
It requires a daily, active, and frankly, exhausting commitment to reality.
It is exhausting.
Because if you let the disinformation take root, it doesn't just mess with your internal mental state, it radically alters your external behavior.
Which brings us back to the streets of ancient Thessalonica.
Exactly. It brings us to the breakdown of their daily community life.
Right, because how did this apocalyptic anxiety actually manifest on a Thursday morning? If your brain is genuinely convinced the world is ending on Friday, why would you bother showing up for your shift at the mill on Thursday?
You wouldn't.
Why would you plant wheat that you will never harvest? Why would you fix a leaking roof if the sky's about to roll up like a scroll?
It's entirely illogical to plan for a future you believe doesn't exist.
And this logical conclusion leads directly to the sudden economic and social crisis Paul had to deal with next, and his subsequent, incredibly harsh reprimand.
The situation in the city had degraded rapidly. Because of this end times panic, a significant segment of the community had completely abandoned their jobs.
They just quit.
They had become voluntarily idle. But they weren't just sitting quietly in their homes meditating. They were living off the shared charity of the rest of the community.
Freeloading.
And they had become what Paul calls busybodies. Paul addresses this with a level of bluntness that is almost shocking.
What does he say?
He institutes a strict, non-negotiable rule for the community. If anyone is not willing to work, don't let him eat.
If you don't work, you don't eat. Wow. Okay, I can already hear the modern pushback on this. In 2026, that sounds incredibly harsh.
It does.
It sounds like a complete lack of compassion, almost like a hyper-capitalist slogan devoid of any social safety net or empathy for those struggling.
It does sound jarring to modern ears, especially in cultures that debate universal basic income and social welfare. But to understand the necessity of this rule, we really have to look closely at the Greek words Paul uses to describe the behavior of these people.
Okay, break it down for me.
He says they're walking disorderly. The Greek word is ataktos.
Hitektos.
Yes. And this is actually a military term. It originally referred to soldiers who break ranks in a formation.
Break ranks, like in a Roman phalanx.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Picture the ancient military tactic of the phalanx. Men stood shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping.
Right, a solid wall.
Your shield protected the range side of the man to your left. The strength of the unit depended entirely on everyone holding their position.
So if one guy steps out,
If one soldier decides to drop his shield and wander off, if he walks ataktos, he doesn't just expose himself to danger, he creates a literal gap in the wall where the enemy can pour in and slaughter his friends.
oh, wow. That changes the context entirely.
Doesn't it?
It isn't just about personal laziness, it is about community endangerment.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Paul also uses the word atopos, which means unreasonable, or literally out of place.
Out of place.
These people were not resting in a vacuum. By abandoning their duties, they were actively disrupting the survival of the group. Remember the context we established earlier. This community was already under immense pressure from severe persecution.
They barely had anything to begin with.
They had highly limited resources. And now, perfectly capable people were draining those scarce resources because they had become obsessed with a theological conspiracy theory.
And Barnes notes something really fascinating about this maxim: if you don't work, you don't eat. It wasn't just some unique, severe Christian rule invented by Paul, right?
No, Barnes points out that this was a well-known Jewish proverb long before Paul wrote it. Furthermore, similar sentiments regarding the necessity of labor are found in the classical writings of Homer, Demosthenes, and Pythagoras.
So it's basically a universal law.
It touches on a universal human truth about the inherent dignity of labor and the fundamental social contract.
The social contract being that we all pitch in.
Exactly. To consume the resources of a community when you are fully capable of contributing to it simply because you refuse to engage with reality is a violation of basic justice.
Let's use an analogy to bring this into a modern context. Think of that one coworker we have all had the misfortune of dealing with.
Oh, we all know one.
The person who completely abandons their own assigned tasks. But they aren't just sitting at their desk quietly doing nothing.
No, they're everywhere.
Instead, they are roaming the halls, micromanaging everyone else, gossiping in the break room, stirring up interpersonal drama, and offering unsolicited opinions on projects they have absolutely nothing to do with. They are the ultimate busybody. And what happens to the team? That one person drains the creative and emotional energy of the entire department. They create chaos where there should be focus.
And Paul's diagnosis of human nature in this regard is extraordinarily sharp. He understood that if the human mind is not employed in doing meaningful work, it will inevitably busy itself in doing nothing or doing evil.
Idle hands, basically.
The idleness bred a chaotic meddling. They were neglecting their own business to interfere in everyone else's lives, trying to convince everyone else that the sky was falling.
So what does this all mean for us today in a world where global anxiety is basically through the roof?
This is a vital question.
When we feel overwhelmed by the state of the world, by volatile politics, by climate change, by the economy, our modern instinct is often to check out.
We retreat.
We quiet quit our jobs, we withdraw from our families, we spend 8 hours a day on social media arguing with strangers, meddling in online controversies that we have absolutely zero control over.
We become digital busybodies. We abandon the physical phalanx to fight phantom wars online.
Exactly. I love that phrasing. We abandon the physical phalanx. And Paul's challenge to that behavior is radical, but it's deeply grounding. He says the best, most effective response to global anxiety is local responsibility. He writes, "With quietness they work and eat their own bread."
Study to be quiet and do your own business. It is a profound antidote to chaos.
It really is.
When the macro world feels like it is spinning completely out of control, you cannot fix it by panicking.
And you cannot fix it by meddling in other people's affairs.
You fix your mind by taking control of your micro world. You wash the dishes, you balance your spreadsheets, you show up for your kids, you contribute to your local economy.
You do your work.
Quiet, meaningful, daily work is the anchor that keeps the ship from being tossed by the violent waves of existential dread.
That is incredibly practical advice for navigating a high anxiety era. So for the listener, here is your question to chew on today. Where in your life are you currently acting as a busybody?
A great question for self-reflection.
Where are you obsessing over global events or other people's drama, things entirely outside of your control, while actively neglecting the actual tangible duties sitting right in front of you?
It's an easy trap to fall into.
It is. The practice here is simple, though obviously not easy. Reclaim your focus. Turn off the news feed for a day. Look at what is immediately in your hands and do your own quiet work.
But, that leads us directly to a very difficult social dynamic.
Oh, the discipline aspect.
Yes, because the obvious question arises for any community. If the standard rule is to quietly work, what is a community supposed to do with the people who absolutely refuse to comply?
What do you do with the individuals who continue to drain resources, spread disinformation, and generate chaos despite repeated warnings?
Right. What do you do with the guy who refuses to get back in the shield wall and is putting everyone else in danger?
Paul has an answer for that too, doesn't he?
He does. And he gives a directive that requires a highly sophisticated level of emotional intelligence. He commands the church. If any man obey not our word by this epistle, note that man and have no company with him, that he may be ashamed.
Have no company with him. I mean, that sounds like complete exile. It sounds like excommunication.
It is a very firm boundary. It is a directive to absolutely cut off social enabling.
Yeah.
But listen to the very next sentence because it completely changes the motivation and the tone of the action.
Okay, what's the next sentence?
Yet count him not as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother.
Count him not as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother?
Count him not as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother. I have to be honest. That sounds nearly impossible to execute in real life.
It is incredibly difficult. The expert commentators highlight the profound, delicate balance required here.
Because you're kicking them out but not hating them?
Exactly. The goal of drawing the strict boundary of withdrawing fellowship and refusing to eat with them is not punitive destruction.
It's not about revenge. It is not about crushing the person's spirit or ruining their life. It is entirely about restoration. It is a withdrawal of participation in their dysfunction, not a withdrawal of love for their humanity.
Matthew Henry has a really sharp historical insight on this, doesn't he? It contrasts heavily with how the church behaved in later centuries.
Yes, Henry points out how radically different this apostolic instruction is from the historical practices of excommunication that developed later in church history.
Like during the Middle Ages.
Right. In the Middle Ages and during the various inquisitions, excommunication often meant delivering someone to the civil authorities to be tortured or burned at the stake.
Which is obviously the opposite of admonish as a brother.
Completely. Or it meant subjecting them to extreme, dehumanizing shunning, where they were treated like a literal demon. Henry notes that Paul's method is pastoral care, not a tribunal.
Pastoral care.
You maintain the standards and the health of the community without ever dehumanizing the offender. You make them feel the weight of their actions, the social shame of being out of step with reality, so that they will wake up, abandon their delusion, and return to the fold.
If we look at this through a modern lens, I can't help but compare this to modern cancel culture.
That's a very fitting modern parallel.
Because today, if someone steps out of line, if they say the wrong thing or behave poorly, society's immediate instinct is to instantly brand them an irredeemable enemy.
We permanently exile them.
We do. We try to destroy their livelihood, their reputation, their entire existence. We reduce their entire humanity to their worst mistake or their worst opinion.
Cancel culture is entirely punitive. It has no built-in mechanism for restoration or forgiveness. It only knows how to destroy and isolate.
Exactly. But what Paul is suggesting here is something much harder, much more emotionally taxing than simply canceling someone. He's suggesting a loving intervention.
An intervention, yes.
Think of a family dealing with a relative who is struggling with severe drug addiction.
That's a powerful analogy.
If that relative is continually stealing from the family to fund their habit, the family eventually has to set a hard boundary. You kick them out of the house. You refuse to give them money. You withdraw your company so you do not enable their destruction.
You have no company with them.
Right. But, and this is the crucial part that makes it an intervention rather than a cancellation, you never stop seeing them as family. You do not consider them your mortal enemy. You are waiting, hoping, and praying for the day they get clean so you can welcome them back with open arms. You are admonishing them as a brother.
That is a beautiful and painful analogy, and it perfectly captures the spirit of the ancient text. It is about refusing to fund the habit of idleness and chaos, refusing to let their dysfunction destroy the community while intentionally keeping the door open for the human being.
It's a tough balance.
It challenges us to ask hard questions about how we view the people who disrupt our lives. Do we secretly enjoy punishing them?
Oof, that's a convicting question.
Do we feel a sense of self-righteous superiority when we cut them off? Or does it genuinely break our hearts to have to set the boundary?
So to you listening, think about how you handle conflict in your own life, especially with difficult people who are causing chaos. When someone crosses a line or acts toxically, do you instantly categorize them as a monster?
Do you mentally write them off as a permanent enemy?
Or can you do the incredibly difficult, mature work of setting a firm, uncomfortable boundary saying, I will not participate in this illusion with you, while still treating them deep down as a sibling in the human family?
It is the difference between amputation and setting a broken bone. Both procedures are highly painful, but only one is designed to heal the body.
Man, we have covered a massive amount of ground today.
We really have.
From the pressure cooker of first-century persecution, to the panic of apocalyptic disinformation, to the profound dignity of quiet work, and finally, the painful art of loving discipline.
And through it all, there is remarkable consistency in how this ancient text views human nature.
What do you mean by that?
It recognizes our immense fragility, how easily we are shaken in mind by rumors and fear. But it simultaneously demands our resilience. It refuses to let us wallow in panic or sink into idleness.
As we wrap up this deep dive into 2 Thessalonians, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, something we haven't explicitly stated yet, but that echoes through the background of every single chapter we've discussed today.
I'm intrigued. What is it?
This letter shows us that waiting for a future event, whether it is a religious second coming, a massive career promotion, or a long-hoped-for societal shift, should never, ever paralyze your present reality.
That is profound.
True anticipation isn't found in looking up at the sky in a state of panic, waiting for the end of the story. True anticipation is found in looking down at your hands right here, right now, and asking, what good can I build today? That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.